had a number of very, very infamous, if you will, assassinations from JFK to Robert Kennedy to Martin Luther King and some smaller, lesser known people. Very bad. Very bad. It was a tumultuous time. The decade was tumultuous for the United States. No doubt about it. There was a lot of change that would come out of the 60s. A lot of it not for the better. But a lot of change would come out of the 60s. And one of the things that came out of the 60s was this free thought, free love type of movement. And of course, it morphed and evolved into the 70s, into the power, the power to the women and the sexual revolution and that kind of thing. And I'm not going to get into that, but we know what happened in the 70s and the 80s. Sexually transmitted diseases exploded because of the sexual revolution. That was not a good thing. Free love was not free, we found out. It had a cost, a very high cost. And we're still paying that cost, by the way. So this whole notion that, that we're evolving into becoming more enlightened is not actually true, because we started this modern enlightenment age of Aquarius back in the 60s. It has not been very good or successful for not only this country, but for much of the Western world and the planet. But I digress, because I'm talking about Mad Men. Well, this is all part of Mad Men. Now, last night, it took a turn that I did not expect. Well, you know about Pete getting the Learjet job. Congratulations, good for Pete. He finally got the recognition and the cash that came along with that recognition that he'd been longing for. I mean, if you watch the entire series from season 1 to season 7, you saw Peter just grappling with not believing that he was being paid and being recognized for the apparent marketing and sales genius that he thought he was. And to a certain degree, he was. He was pretty damn good at his job. And for a while, he wasn't being recognized. And there were times when the most unlikely ally would sort of throw out a life jacket and a lifeline to Pete. And that was Don Draper. When they formed when they formed the partnership, the new ad company, and things were looking dire, and the partners had to pony up some money. Well, Pete didn't have that kind of money, and Don threw him a lifeline, and that forever changed their relationship. Pete saw something different in Don at that particular point. Sure, there was still contention later on between the two, but he saw something different. Their relationship became, for men of that era, a little bit closer. But Pete finally got what he was looking for. Now, we're left to believe that, as Pete gets on a Learjet back in 71, that he's finally made it and he lives happily ever after. I like to think that's true, and that him and his wife die together. And then we see Peggy Olson. Now, she too had been, we're coming out of an era where women were blazing the trail to be treated more equally. Her and Joan were kind of two peas in the pod, but very different. Very different. Joan was this buxom, beautiful, very well dressed, very well spoken, professional woman. Peggy was a little bit unkept, uncouth. She was a little bit naive. She, up until like halfway through the series, she was wearing more girly clothes. And then Joan told her, if you want people to take you serious, stop dressing like a little girl. We saw probably the person that grew the most, matured the most, was Peggy Olson. And she got to a point where she worked so hard to get people to recognize her ability, and people started to recognize her ability, and yet she did not understand it or recognize it or readily accept it. She was blind to it. I mean, she, in the closing moments, there's a gentleman that she worked with for years that you could see he pined for her, but she was oblivious to him, even though they worked together. And then when he just drops the bomb, because Joan actually does something that nobody really thought she would do for Peggy. Because, Joan was the person that would always constantly tell Peggy that, you're being a little bratty, little 12-year-old biddy here. Peggy, grow up. She was constantly at Peggy. But then in the end, Joan is like, Peggy, you got the talent. You got the drive. You got the smarts. I want to make you a partner in this new company I want to start. Me and you, 50-50. And for the first time, Peggy sees, wow, people are recognizing my talent and my ability. And then the bomb drops. And now, if you haven't seen, I'm not going to tell you who, when she's told that, I love you. I don't want you to leave McCann Erickson. And Peggy realizes, you know what? She goes through her life with this guy. And she realizes, you know what? I love you too. Because she didn't pay attention to what was in front of her all along. Don Draper gave her, she started out as a secretary. Don gave her the chance, the opportunity to be something more than the secretary. She proved herself, but she never believed that she did. It was in front of her all the time. And it took two people in the last episode for her to realize that she had something all along that she had been wanting. She already had it. And she didn't know she had it. And of course, Roger's always Roger. Not going to change there. But, and Bertie, the shock, the horror. A lot of people today will say, oh, no, she can live. No. Betty was given a death sentence. Back in 1970-71, if you got cancer, it was over 90% fatal. It was a death sentence. There was no treatment for it. You were done. She contracted lung cancer. Smoking, evidently, is what they're trying to tell us. Smoking cigarettes. In the 60s and 50s and 60s, Americans were heavy smokers, heavy boozers. And she gets lung cancer. She still has little children. This is devastating news. For the viewer, for the fan. Betsy's going to die. It's the end of the road for her. While Don is out trying to find himself. And he ends up someplace most unlikely. I mean, he gives away his car. He takes the blame for something that he did not do, didn't even think about doing, didn't want to do, didn't need to do. He takes the blame, but he still fixes it. And he gives away his Cadillac. I mean, he's just out there searching and searching. And then he gets to California. He's back to where he began, if you will, with his real name, Dick, not Don. And he is in this commune. You can call the girl his niece. That's all I'm going to say about her. Not really his niece, but call her his niece. And he comes back because he thinks that he's missing something and that he wants to help her But really, he's looking for help himself. And he goes along with her to this retreat in Northern California. And all of a sudden, while he's there, he comes to this revelation, and he calls Peggy, of all people, he calls Peggy Olson. He's been missing for weeks now. He's at this commune. He calls Peggy Olson. Now, remember what I said. He gave Peggy a chance because he saw something in her that she didn't see in herself. And who does he end up calling? Does he call Joan? No. Does he call Roger, who could be arguably, throughout the series, Don's best friend? Does he call Roger? No. He calls Peggy Olson because she understands him, even though she doesn't really know his true past. She still understands him. He calls her. He has like a moment, if you will. Not a heart attack, an anxiety attack. He doesn't know who he is all of a sudden, or what he's doing, or what he wants to do, or who he wants to be. So he sticks at that commune, even though his niece takes off in the middle of the night and leaves him behind. So he sticks around the commune. And at one of the last scenes, you see Don in this commune meditating in the early morning. In the yoga pose. I still can't do that pose. I don't know how they do it, but wish I could do that. And I even took martial arts back in the day, and I could do almost a full leg split, but I could never get my legs to lay like that during the meditation pose. But there they are. He's doing the meditation pose, meditating early in the morning with the other members or other visitors. It's like a retreat. Flower children type of thing, all get in touch with your feelings, that kind of crap. And he's sitting there, just meditating, and all of a sudden, there's a big smile that comes across his face. And people are like, well, what happens to Don? Like, you didn't get it? Because the last scene, it breaks away from Don's smile to the iconic Coke commercial of the 70s and beyond. I'd like to teach the world to sing. Perfect harmony. They're all dressed in the 60s, 70s flower children communal type of garb. In other words, Don created the ad. He figured out who he was. Even though his real name was Dick, he still figured out who he was, what he was best at. He went back to work at McCann and came up with that ad. That's what we got. That's what happened. Because people, they wrapped up the story for us to figure out what happens to them for the rest of their lives. And yes, that's an important type of thing, simply because, you got to know where you are before you can start jumping ahead to where you want to be. You got to know what's going on inside of you. You have got to be awake to the opportunities around you. You have got to fully understand that in this whole program, this series from beginning to end was all about people struggling to be their best and to get the best. They didn't depend on politicians. They didn't depend on government assistance. They did. Look, women needed to stand up for their own rights, and yeah, they did it. They didn't need government to do that. They did it. They became powerful women. They became business moguls from the 60s and 70s. Yeah, we had a lot of other stuff that came out of that, but that was not so good. But some of the good stuff came out of that era. And it was all about independence. It was about you figuring out who you are, not what somebody else was telling you. Today we have a bunch of politicians telling everybody, what's best for them and who they are and all that kind of stuff. And not in Mad Men. They were telling you who you could be, and you had to figure out what was best about who you could be. Plain and simple.